The morning sun had barely risen over Highland Community Center when Sarah Mitchell pulled into the parking lot in her shiny white Mercedes. The clock on her dashboard showed 7:15 a.m., and she smiled, thinking she would be first in line to vote. Her satisfaction quickly faded when she saw three black men already standing near the entrance, engaged in quiet conversation. James Washington, the tallest of the three, stood with perfect posture in his navy blue suit. As the CEO of a local tech startup, he always dressed to impress, even for a simple trip to the voting booth. Next to him, Marcus Bennett adjusted his red tie, his bank manager badge still clipped to his belt from his early morning stop at the office. Dr. Thomas Carter, a respected civil rights attorney, completed the trio, his briefcase containing case files he planned to review after voting. The autumn air was crisp, and their breath formed small clouds as they discussed the upcoming school board election. "My daughter's school really needs that funding increase," Marcus was saying, checking his watch. "That's why this vote matters so much." Sarah walked past them, her designer handbag clutched tightly against her chest. She made a show of moving as far away as possible, nearly stepping into a puddle in the process. The three men noticed but continued their conversation, having experienced similar reactions before. More voters began arriving, forming a line that wrapped around the building's corner. Among them was elderly Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been voting at this location for 40 years. She smiled warmly at everyone, offering homemade cookies she baked for the occasion. The three men graciously accepted, making small talk about her grandchildren. As the line grew, Sarah became increasingly agitated. She kept looking over her shoulder at James, Marcus, and Dr. Carter, then typing furiously on her phone. A young couple behind her, Amy and Mike Chen, noticed her behavior and exchanged concerned glances. At 7:45 a.m., poll manager Robert Turner unlocked the doors. He was a retired high school principal who had been managing this polling station for the past 8 years. "Good morning, everyone," he called out cheerfully. "Please have your IDs ready." The line moved forward smoothly. James, Marcus, and Dr. Carter presented their identification without incident, following all proper procedures. But when Sarah saw them being processed normally, she stepped out of line and approached the check-in table. "Excuse me," she said loudly, her voice shaking with barely contained anger. "Are you really going to let them vote without extra verification? Don't you know about all the fraud happening these days?" Robert Turner remained professional but firm. "Ma'am, all voters are treated equally here. These gentlemen have provided proper identification and are registered voters in this district." Sarah's face turned red. She pulled out her phone and began recording, walking closer to where the three men were receiving their ballots. "I'm documenting everything," she announced to no one in particular. "This whole thing looks very suspicious to me." Other voters began murmuring disapprovingly. Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward, her cookie container now empty. "Young lady," she said firmly, "I've been voting here since before you were born. The only suspicious behavior I see is yours." The three men maintained their dignity throughout the incident. They collected their ballots and proceeded to the voting booths, ignoring Sarah's continued commentary. Dr. Carter, drawing from years of experience handling tense situations, whispered to his friends, "Stay calm, we have every right to be here." As they marked their ballots, Sarah's voice grew louder. She demanded to speak to supervisors, insisted on seeing registration documents, and continued filming with her phone. Poll workers calmly explained the voting process and privacy rules, but she refused to listen. The morning sun now streamed through the windows, illuminating the scene. Three professional men peacefully exercising their right to vote, a community of diverse voters showing solidarity, and one angry woman about to make a decision that would change many lives, including her own. What no one knew at that moment was that this was only the beginning. Sarah Mitchell was about to make a phone call that would not only disrupt the peaceful morning, but would also spark a chain of events that would resonate far beyond the walls of Highland Community Center. Sarah Mitchell stepped outside the Highland Community Center, her hands shaking as she pulled out her phone. Behind her, James, Marcus, and Dr. Carter had finished voting and were gathering their belongings. The morning had grown warmer, but the atmosphere inside the polling station remained tense. Before making her call, Sarah paced back and forth near the entrance, recording short video clips and muttering to herself. "This is unacceptable," she said loudly enough for others to hear. "I know what's really going on here." Her designer heels clicked against the concrete as she walked, drawing attention from voters still arriving. Inside, poll manager Robert Turner was speaking quietly with his staff. "Remember your training," he told them calmly. "Every voter has equal rights here, and we must maintain order." The young poll workers nodded, though they kept glancing nervously at the door where Sarah's shadow passed back and forth. Mrs. Rodriguez had stayed behind after voting, worried about the situation. She sat in a chair near the entrance, pretending to organize her empty cookie container while actually keeping watch. Her 40 years of voting experience told her something was about to happen. James, Marcus, and Dr. Carter gathered their things slowly, discussing their plans for the rest of the day. "I have a meeting at 10, James said, checking his watch. "But I think we should document what's happening here." Marcus agreed, while Dr. Carter quietly took notes on his phone, his legal training kicking in. The tension broke when Sarah burst back into the building, phone held high like a weapon. "I've been recording everything," she announced loudly. "I have proof of suspicious activity. These men," she pointed directly at James, Marcus, and Dr. Carter, "they can't possibly belong in this voting district." Several things happened at once. Amy Chen, who was still waiting to vote with her husband Mike, stepped forward. "Stop harassing them," she called out. "They have every right to be here." Other voters joined in, creating a chorus of disapproval aimed at Sarah. Robert Turner moved quickly to address the situation. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "recording inside a polling station is against the law. You need to put your phone away immediately." But Sarah wasn't listening. She continued filming, her voice getting louder as she made accusations about voter fraud and suspicious behavior. Dr. Carter calmly turned to his friends. "Don't engage," he advised softly. "This is exactly the kind of voter intimidation we've seen before." James and Marcus nodded, maintaining their composure even as Sarah's rant continued. The police cars arrived with flashing lights but no sirens, pulling smoothly into the Highland Community Center parking lot. 2 officers stepped out. Officer Maria Rodriguez, no relation to Mrs. Rodriguez, and Officer David Chen. They had received what dispatch described as a disturbance call at the polling station. Sarah Mitchell rushed out to meet them, her phone still recording everything. Her designer heels clicked rapidly against the pavement as she hurried toward the officers, her face flushed with excitement. "Finally," she exclaimed. "I'm the one who called about the suspicious voters." Inside, James, Marcus, and Dr. Carter remained calm, though their faces showed concern. They had seen situations like this before. Dr. Carter quietly activated his phone's voice recorder, while Marcus sent a quick text to his law firm. James stood tall, his years of dealing with corporate challenges helping him maintain his composure. Officer Rodriguez took the lead, her experienced eyes quickly scanning the scene. "Ma'am, can you explain exactly what happened?" she asked Sarah, pulling out her notepad. Officer Chen moved toward the building's entrance, where Robert Turner was already stepping out to meet him. Sarah's voice rose higher as she spoke. "There are 3 men in there," she said, pointing dramatically at the building. "They just walked in and voted. They don't look like they belong in this neighborhood. I'm sure they're committing fraud." Mrs. Rodriguez, who had followed everyone outside, couldn't stay quiet any longer. "Officer," she called out, "I've lived here 40 years. Those men she's accusing, they're pillars of our community. Dr. Carter volunteers at the hospital. Mr. Washington runs a company that employs local people. Mr. Bennett helps people get home loans." Other voters began sharing similar stories. Amy Chen stepped forward with her phone, showing Officer Rodriguez the videos she recorded of Sarah's behavior. "She's been harassing them since they arrived," Amy explained. "She's the only one causing problems here." Officer Chen finished speaking with Robert Turner and rejoined his partner. "Sir," he called to Turner, "could you please ask those 3 gentlemen to step outside?" Turner nodded and went back inside. When James, Marcus, and Dr. Carter emerged, they carried themselves with dignity. Dr. Carter spoke first, his voice steady and professional. "Officers, we're happy to show you our IDs and proof of residence. We've followed every voting regulation properly." Sarah interrupted loudly. "But look at them. They can't possibly live around here." As soon as the words left her mouth, several people gasped. Officer Rodriguez's expression hardened. "Ma'am," she said firmly, "what exactly do you mean by that statement?" The moment grew tense as Sarah realized what she'd said. Her phone, still recording, captured her stumbling over her words. I just meant, well, this neighborhood. She gestured vaguely, digging herself deeper with each word. Officer Chen checked the three men's identification quickly. Everything's in order here, he announced. Then he turned to Sarah. Ma'am, do you realize it's illegal to make false police reports? It's also illegal to intimidate voters. Sarah's face paled. Her phone nearly slipped from her trembling hands. But I was just trying to protect the integrity of the election, she protested. Behind her, someone in the crowd muttered, more like trying to protect white privilege. Officer Rodriguez took out her own notepad. Ms. Mitchell, we need to take your statement about why you called 911. Be advised that everything you say can be used in an official investigation of voter intimidation. The morning sun now hung high in the sky, casting harsh light on the scene. Sarah standing alone, her designer outfit suddenly seeming out of place. The three men she'd accused speaking quietly with Officer Chen, and a diverse crowd of community members watching it all unfold. Jake, the college student who had been live streaming, checked his phone and whistled softly. This is going viral, he announced to no one in particular. The video already has thousands of views. The news seemed to hit Sarah like a physical blow, and she'd finally lowered her phone. What Sarah didn't know was that her morning of misguided actions was about to become more than just a viral video. As Officer Rodriguez began taking her statement, the wheels of justice, both legal and social, were already turning, setting in motion events that would change many lives in unexpected ways. By noon, the morning's events at Highland Community Center had taken over social media. Jake's livestream had been shared thousands of times, and clips of Sarah Mitchell's behavior were spreading across every platform. The hashtag #VotingWhileBlack started trending, along with hashtag HighlandKaren. In his downtown office, James Washington sat at his desk, his phone buzzing nonstop. His company's PR team had already received dozens of calls from news outlets wanting to hear his story. He watched as the view count on the videos grew higher and higher, his hands folded calmly on his desk. You need to see this, Marcus Bennett said, walking into James's office with his tablet. He pulled up a new video that someone had pieced together. It showed different angles of the morning's events, including Sarah's racial comments to the police. The video already had over 100,000 views after just 2 hours. Dr. Carter was in his law office, watching his email inbox fill up. Civil rights organizations from across the country were reaching out, offering support and legal assistance. His secretary had stopped trying to screen the calls. There were simply too many. Meanwhile, Sarah Mitchell was having a very different experience. She sat alone in her real estate office, watching her professional reputation crumble in real time. Her social media accounts were flooded with angry comments. Someone had found her business profile and started sharing it widely. The review section of her realtor page was filling up with 1-star ratings. Have you seen what they're saying about me? Sarah cried into her phone, talking to her sister in Chicago. They're making me look like a monster. I was just trying to protect the voting process. Her sister's response was not what she expected. Sarah, you're trending on Twitter. Mom's already called me 3 times about it. Back at the Highland Community Center, regular voting continued, but now news vans lined the parking lot. Mrs. Rodriguez had stayed to talk with reporters, defending the 3 men she'd known for years. This is not who we are as a community, she told a local news reporter, her empty cookie container still in her hands. Amy Chen's video, showing Sarah's confrontation with the police, had been picked up by national news websites. The comment sections were filling up with similar stories from across the country. People began sharing their own experiences of voter intimidation, creating a larger conversation about racism at polling places. By early afternoon, several civil rights organizations had released statements. The National Voting Rights Association announced they would be investigating the incident. Local community leaders called for a town hall meeting to discuss voter intimidation. Jake, whose live stream had started it all, was being interviewed by a popular online news channel. I just felt like people needed to see what was happening, he explained, still somewhat shocked by how quickly his video had spread. I never expected it to blow up like this. Dr. Carter received a call from his old law professor, now a respected civil rights attorney in Washington, D.C., Thomas. The professor said, This could be a landmark case for voter intimidation. How do you want to handle it? Dr. Carter looked at the photos on his office wall, showing his family's history of fighting for voting rights. With dignity, he replied, but firmly. Sarah's broker called her into his office late in the afternoon. Her hands shook as she opened his door. The look on his face told her everything she needed to know. On his computer screen, a petition calling for her firing had already gathered over 50,000 signatures. As the day continued, more videos surfaced. Security cameras from the community center had captured additional angles. Someone had edited them together with dramatic music, creating a mini documentary that was rapidly gathering views. Each new post seemed to add another layer to the story. The sun was setting when James, Marcus, and Dr. Carter met again, this time at a quiet coffee shop away from the media attention. They watched as their phones continued to light up with notifications. "What happens now?" Marcus asked, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. Dr. Carter looked at his friends, understanding the weight of the moment. "Now," he said, "we make sure this leads to real change." The Highland Community Center's main hall was packed by 7 p.m. the next evening. People sat shoulder to shoulder in folding chairs, with more standing along the walls. Robert Turner, still in his poll manager vest from another day of managing voters, counted over 300 people in attendance. Mayor Lisa Chen stood at the podium, facing the crowd. She hadn't planned on holding an emergency town hall meeting, but after yesterday's events went viral, she knew the community needed to come together. Behind her sat James Washington, Marcus Bennett, and Dr. Carter, along with other community leaders. "What happened yesterday was unacceptable," Mayor Chen began, her voice firm. "But how we respond to it will define our community." The crowd nodded in agreement, many holding up phones to record the meeting. Jake, whose live stream had started it all, sat in the front row, once again broadcasting live. Mrs. Rodriguez had baked cookies again, this time enough for everyone. She moved through the crowd, passing out her famous chocolate chip cookies while sharing her first-hand account of yesterday's events. "I've never been more proud of how our community stood together," she told everyone who would listen. A young woman named Rachel stood up to speak. "I'm launching a program called Vote Together," she announced. "We'll organize groups to accompany anyone who feels unsafe voting." The idea spread through the room like wildfire, with dozens of people immediately signing up to volunteer. Marcus Bennett approached the podium next. "My bank will provide free transportation to polling stations for the rest of the election season," he declared. The crowd erupted in applause. James Washington followed, announcing that his tech company would create a free app to help voters find their polling places and connect with voting buddies. Dr. Carter's speech drew the most attention. "Yesterday showed us two things," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "First, that racism in voting still exists, but second, and more importantly, that our community will not tolerate it." He then announced the creation of a legal aid hotline for voters experiencing intimidation. Local business owners stood up one by one, pledging support. The owner of Highland Coffee Shop promised free coffee to all poll workers. The local printing shop offered to make free Vote Together t-shirts. Even the high school principal offered the school's buses for voter transportation. Amy Chen, who had recorded Sarah's behavior, shared her videos with the crowd. "Look how many people stepped up to help," she pointed out. "That's the real story here." The videos showed dozens of community members defending the three men, proving that Sarah Mitchell had been the outlier, not the norm. In the back of the room, Officer Rodriguez and Officer Chen attended in civilian clothes. They spoke briefly about proper polling place procedures and promised increased patrols around voting locations. "But based on what we've seen tonight," Officer Rodriguez added, "this community knows how to take care of its own." The meeting shifted to action planning. People formed groups based on how they could help. Some volunteered to be voting buddies, others offered legal expertise, and many signed up to monitor polling places for intimidation. The energy in the room was electric with purpose. Robert Turner watched it all with satisfaction. "In 20 years of running polling places," he told the crowd, "I've never seen a community come together like this." He then announced a new training program for poll workers, focusing on handling intimidation attempts. As the meeting wound down, people lingered to talk and make plans. Mrs. Rodriguez's cookie container was empty again, but hearts were full. The Vote Together sign-up sheet had over 200 names. The legal aid hotline already had 50 volunteer lawyers. Outside, news crews interviewed attendees. The story had evolved from one of racism to one of community triumph. Highland shows how to stand together, read one headline. Another declared local community turns voting incident into movement for change. James, Marcus, and Dr. Carter stayed until the end, talking with everyone who approached them. They were no longer just victims of discrimination. They had become symbols of positive change. As they finally left the community center, they saw families walking home together, talking excitedly about their plans to help. The night ended with a clear message. What Sarah Mitchell had meant for intimidation had instead sparked a movement of unity. The Highland community had shown that when faced with hatred, love and solidarity could be the most powerful response. The morning sun had barely risen when Sarah Mitchell arrived at Prestige Real Estate's main office. Her hands trembled as she swiped her keycard at the entrance. Over the past 2 days, the videos of her behavior at the polling station had spread everywhere, and now she was facing the consequences. Inside her office, Sarah found her email inbox overflowing with angry messages. The company's phone lines had been ringing non-stop since yesterday. Even worse, potential clients were canceling appointments, and several current clients had already requested different agents. "Ms. Mitchell, Mr. Richardson wants to see you immediately," her assistant said quietly, avoiding eye contact. Tom Richardson was the owner of Prestige Real Estate, and in 20 years, he had built it into the most respected agency in the region. Sarah's stomach dropped as she walked toward his corner office. The waiting room was unusually full. The company's lead attorney sat there, along with the HR director and the marketing manager. Their faces were serious as they watched her pass. Through the glass walls, Sarah could see Mr. Richardson pacing, phone pressed to his ear. Meanwhile, across town, James Washington sat in his company's boardroom. His phone showed another notification. The video of Sarah had now reached 5 million views. His own company's social media team had been carefully monitoring the situation, proud of how their CEO had handled the incident. Back at Prestige Real Estate, Mr. Richardson's secretary finally called Sarah in. The office felt colder than usual. Mr. Richardson sat behind his large desk, the morning news playing silently on a wall-mounted TV. Sarah's face was on the screen. "Sit down, Sarah," Mr. Richardson said firmly. On his computer screen, she could see the company's social media pages, flooded with negative comments. Their perfect 5-star rating had dropped to 2 stars overnight. "Do you understand what your actions have done to this company?" Sarah tried to explain. "I was just trying to protect the voting process," she began, but Mr. Richardson held up his hand. He turned his monitor to show her the numbers. Client cancellations had cost the company over $500,000 in lost commissions already. Their reputation, built over 2 decades, was crumbling. The HR director entered with a thick folder. "We've received over 200 discrimination complaints," she reported. "The National Association of Realtors is considering revoking her license." Sarah's face grew pale as she realized how serious the situation had become. Outside the office, the marketing team was working frantically to control the damage. They had already released 2 public statements distancing the company from Sarah's actions, but the angry comments kept coming. Competitor agencies were using the situation to promote their own inclusive policies. Mr. Richardson stood up slowly. "Sarah," he said, his voice heavy, "you've left us no choice. Your actions go against everything this company stands for. We cannot and will not tolerate racial discrimination of any kind." He nodded to the HR director, who stepped forward with termination papers. As Sarah cleaned out her desk, her phone kept buzzing with notifications. Other real estate agencies in the area had already blacklisted her. The local real estate board was meeting that afternoon to discuss her membership. Her professional reputation, built over 15 years, had disappeared in less than 48 hours. The news of Sarah's firing spread quickly through social media. Marcus Bennett saw it first and shared it with James and Dr. Carter. They were meeting with civil rights lawyers to discuss their case, but the news made them pause. "Actions have consequences," Dr. Carter said quietly. By afternoon, Prestige Real Estate had completely removed Sarah's profile from their website. Mr. Richardson called an all-staff meeting to reinforce the company's commitment to diversity and announced mandatory anti-bias training for all employees. He also revealed a new partnership with Marcus Bennett's bank to help underserved communities achieve homeownership. Sarah left the building through the back door, carrying a box of personal items. As she walked to her car, she passed a newspaper stand. The local paper's headline read, "Real estate agent fired after viral voting incident." Below it was a smaller headline, "Community leaders praise swift corporate response to racism." The sun was setting as Sarah drove home, her car's backseat filled with items from her office. Her phone had finally stopped buzzing. Most people had already unfollowed her on social media. She had become, in less than 3 days, a cautionary tale about how quickly racism could destroy a career in modern America. The county courthouse stood tall in the morning light as District Attorney Maria Patel reviewed the files on her desk. 1 week had passed since the Highland Community Center incident, and the evidence against Sarah Mitchell was substantial. Videos, witness statements, and police reports filled multiple folders. In her home, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, staring at 2 official letters. The first was from the district attorney's office, informing her of potential criminal charges for voter intimidation and filing a false police report. The second was from Dr. Carter's law firm, notifying her of a civil lawsuit. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone to call her lawyer. Meanwhile, Dr. Carter sat in his law office with James and Marcus, discussing their case with a team of civil rights attorneys. "This isn't just about us," Dr. Carter explained, pointing to a map showing similar incidents across the country. "This is about making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Sarah's attorney, Bill Thompson, wasn't happy when she finally reached his office. "You made things worse by recording yourself," he said, reviewing the videos on his laptop. "Everything you said and did is documented. This isn't going to be an easy case to defend." The district attorney's office called a press conference at noon. Television cameras lined the courthouse steps as DA Patel approached the podium. "Today, we are announcing criminal charges against Sarah Mitchell for voter intimidation and filing a false police report," she declared. "Our office takes any attempt to interfere with voting rights very seriously." Back at his bank, Marcus received a call from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. They wanted to join the civil lawsuit as co-plaintiffs, seeing it as an important voting rights case. "This could set a precedent," their lawyer explained. "We need to show there are serious consequences for voter intimidation." Sarah's sister watched the news coverage from Chicago, calling their parents in Florida. "They're saying she could face up to 2 years in jail," she reported worriedly. Their father, a retired judge, shook his head sadly. "She should have known better. Voting rights violations are serious federal offenses." Officer Rodriguez and Officer Chen were called to the DA's office to give official statements. They described Sarah's behavior in detail, including her discriminatory comments. "She specifically targeted these men based on their race," Officer Rodriguez testified. "Her own recordings prove it." The civil rights lawsuit grew larger as more organizations joined. The National Voting Rights Alliance added their support, and several prominent civil rights lawyers offered to help pro bono. Dr. Carter's small office became a hub of legal activity, with lawyers working late into the night preparing documents. Sarah's world grew smaller each day. Her lawyer advised her to stay off social media and avoid public places. When she checked her mail, she found letters from the state real estate board, officially suspending her license pending investigation. The criminal charges meant she couldn't even apply for jobs in other fields. At the courthouse, Judge Sandra Martinez reviewed the case files. She had handled voting rights cases before, but this one was different. The extensive video evidence and social media documentation made it uniquely modern. She set the first hearing date for the following week. Dr. Carter met with his legal team to discuss strategy. They didn't want just monetary damages. They wanted systemic change. Their lawsuit included demands for mandatory voter protection training at all polling places and the establishment of a voter rights monitoring system. Local civil rights groups organized a rally outside the courthouse. Mrs. Rodriguez was there, once again with her cookies, supporting the cause. "We're not just fighting one incident," she told reporters. "We're fighting for everyone's right to vote without fear." Sarah's lawyer called with more bad news. The evidence was overwhelming, and he recommended she consider a plea deal. "The DA is willing to reduce the charges if you agree to certain conditions," he explained. Sarah listened numbly as he listed the requirements. public apology, community service, and mandatory anti-bias training. As the sun set on another day of legal proceedings, Dr. Carter sat in his office reviewing depositions. On his wall hung a photo of his grandfather, who had fought for voting rights in the 1960s. Times have changed, he thought, but the fight continues in new ways. The case was becoming a symbol of changing times, where technology and social media meant that acts of discrimination couldn't stay hidden. Sarah's actions, captured on multiple devices and shared worldwide, were about to become a landmark case in modern voting rights history. 6 months had passed since the incident at Highland Community Center. The community room at the local library was filled with people, but this time the atmosphere was different. Sarah Mitchell stood at the podium, her hands steady as she addressed the crowd. Behind her sat James Washington, Marcus Bennett, and Dr. Carter. "I was wrong," Sarah began, her voice clear and strong. "What I did that day came from a place of fear and prejudice that I didn't even recognize in myself." The audience listened quietly, including Mrs. Rodriguez, who watched from her usual seat in the front row, this time without her cookie container. The journey to this moment had been long and challenging. Instead of pursuing the maximum penalties, the three men had proposed an alternative solution. They'd offered Sarah a chance to participate in a restorative justice program, focusing on education and community healing rather than punishment. Dr. Carter explained their decision to the local newspaper. Sending her to jail wouldn't fix the underlying problem. "We wanted to create real change." The program they designed became a model for handling similar cases across the country. Over the past 6 months, Sarah had completed hundreds of hours of community service, working directly with voting rights organizations. She attended workshops on racial bias, studied the history of voting rights, and most importantly, listened to stories from people in the community. Marcus's bank had created a special program teaching financial literacy in underserved neighborhoods. Sarah, who once sold million-dollar homes, now helped first-time homebuyers understand mortgages. "I see people differently now," she told her sister. "I see them as people, not stereotypes." James's tech company hired Sarah to help develop their new voting rights app. Her experience, both as someone who had discriminated and someone who had learned from it, provided valuable insight. The app helped voters report intimidation and connect with legal resources. The Highland Community Center had changed too. Robert Turner's poll worker training program expanded to other districts. The Vote Together initiative that started in their community spread nationwide. Mrs. Rodriguez still baked cookies for every election day, but now she had helpers. The hardest part, Sarah continued in her speech, was facing my own prejudices. I had to ask myself difficult questions about why I acted that way. She looked at the three men she had once tried to stop from voting. These gentlemen showed me more grace than I deserved. The legal case concluded with Sarah agreeing to share her story at voter rights workshops across the state. Her presentations became powerful testimonies about the importance of confronting bias. Schools and companies requested her as a speaker, along with the three men, to discuss their journey of transformation. Dr. Carter's law firm created a special division focused on voting rights education and prevention of voter intimidation. They used Sarah's case as an example of how communities could address discrimination through education rather than just punishment. The local news station did a follow-up story 1 year after the incident. They showed clips of Sarah working with community groups, teaching about voting rights, and helping new voters register. The contrast with the viral videos from a year ago was striking. "What happened that day was terrible," James said during the broadcast. "But what happened afterward shows how people can change when given the chance." The camera panned to show Sarah helping an elderly voter complete her registration form, both of them smiling. As Sarah finished her speech at the library, she announced a new initiative. She and the three men were starting a foundation focused on promoting voting rights and fighting discrimination through education. The audience, including many who had witnessed the original incident, applauded. Mrs. Rodriguez was the first to stand up during the question period. "I've lived here 40 years, she said, "and I've never been more proud of our community than I am today." She had brought cookies again, but this time Sarah had helped her bake them. The sun was setting as people left the library, talking excitedly about the new foundation. Sarah stood with James, Marcus, and Dr. Carter, taking photos for the local paper. A year ago, they had been on opposite sides of a viral video. Now they were partners in creating positive change. The Highland Community Voting Incident, as it became known, transformed from a story of discrimination into a model for community healing and personal growth. Sarah's journey from being Highland Karen to becoming an advocate for voting rights proved that change was possible, even from the darkest moments.